Hi all, I would like to give a brief introduction to the Sicilian Defence today. After e4, the Sicilian Defence is one of the most popular replies, so black is immediately seeking to unbalance the position and the pawn structure. What is black doing with the move c5, which makes the Sicilian Defence such a successful weapon and very, very popular at all levels? Black is immediately contesting control of the d4 square. So white has a few choices here. On move 2, there are a number of deviations for white for what is known as the mainline Sicilian. The mainline Sicilian is where white plays knight f3 followed by d4. So black has a number of replies here. Say d6 is chosen and the move d4. We have the open Sicilian. So it's called the open Sicilian because open lines are resulting from this pawn exchange. Also, black will usually have semi-open c-file pressure, and white has some pressure on the d line. In many variations of Sicilian, white is castling on the queen side and black on the king side, and both sides are attacking resources at each other, so it makes for very exciting games. Before looking at some of the main names of open Sicilian related variations, let's look quickly at some of the deviations at move 2 after white plays c5. The c3 Sicilian has become popular recently, so black needs to know what he or she is doing. An early d5 is theoretical. There's also knight f6. Also, black may play e6 to try and tempt white to transpose into a French defence after d4, d5. So you need to know what you're doing when white plays c3. Also, there's the dangerous Morra Gambit, which it's useful to know a line, where white's sacking another pawn here, so playing an immediate d4 and then playing c3. And if you take, you could be under a lot of pressure. So either take that second pawn, or maybe consider playing d3, giving the pawn back immediately and playing g6 to fight on the dark squares. That's what I'll prefer doing after this Morra Gambit offering of c3. I'll just play d3. But there's also other variations here. The wing gambit is quite dangerous and very good statistically. So white is playing it as almost like a reversed Benko Gambit. If you take, then a3, and if you take again, you're giving white a lot of pressure. So that could really backfire if you're not careful. Also, after c5, white might play the closed variation of Sicilian, the closed Sicilian, with knight c3. So the idea here is often, for example, after knight c6 to play g3, and we might have this example move sequence. So the play for both sides is distinctly different from the open Sicilian. White often playing for a later f4. As black, if you ever reach this position, try and make sure you can play f5 in return, keep your control of d4, and maybe often play for a6, rook b8, b5, and expand on the queen side to try and increase the influence of this bishop. So these variations need to be understood as important move 2 alternatives if you really want to play the Sicilian successfully, because people won't give you fun by default. They're going to make you suffer. They'll want you to suffer. They'll play obscure variations, or variations which give a small advantage to white, with minimal counterplay for black. Minimal counterplay has always been a priority of grandmasters. They want to win games in a riskless manner. But anyway, let's look now at the open Sicilian variations, which still remain the most popular. So after knight f3, let's look first at the hugely popular Najdorf variation. So d6, d4, so black takes, knight takes d4, knight f6, so immediately attacking that pawn on e4. So white usually replies with knight c3, and now you play a6. So this has been hugely popular, and exponents include Kasparov and Fischer. They had deep theoretical knowledge of this variation. And things like the poison pawn variation in particular are ultra sharp. The word sharp is used, as an adjective for positions which require great precision, and one move could spell disaster. So a6 here. Ideas of a6 include preventing an early bishop b5 check, but also maybe later black's going to play b5 and bishop b7, putting the bishop on an interesting, important diagonal. Let's have a look at an example variation. So say bishop b7 here as a demonstration. So black is exerting more pressure on that e4 square. There's another idea of this b5 is later black can often play for a knight outpost on c4, and if white ever takes with a bishop, then you get the bishop pair. So a6 has a number of ideas behind it. It's a very useful move from a number of perspectives, and that is the start of the hugely popular Najdorf variation. The classical variation is black actually here playing, instead of a6, playing knight c6, so developing another knight. The Scheveningen variation. Now let's go back to move 1 to make sure we have the right move order, and I'll just paste it in and then rewind it. So d4 takes, knight takes d4, you play knight f6, you attack the pawn, and now you play the immediate e6. So you don't play a6. So maybe white will be boring and try and play bishop b5 check and exchange the bishops. If not, you later play bishop e7, castles, and that plan of a6 is often handy with b5 and bishop b7. Or later you can play for, to liberate these pawns in the centre with d5 or e5. White always has to be careful about black doing that. So the Scheveningen variation, because of this flexible pawn centre. The Dragon variation. Now this is very interesting. Paste the moves in. You have this pawn structure in the shape like a fire-breathing dragon, and this bishop is the fire-breathing dragon piece. Let's rewind that and replay it. So e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, you take, then you play knight f6. Now after knight c3 you play g6. So the bishop is fianchettoed, and often white is casting queenside, and it can lead to very exciting games where white's trying to attack you on the h file, but you have to try and generate counterplay against white's king. The games of Grandmaster Chris Ward are well worth looking at. Some brilliant games there, involving sacrifices often on c3 with rook takes c3. The Sveshnikov variation is one of my favourites. Let's have that variation pasted in and now rewind. So e4, c5, knight f3. Now instead of d6 or e6, black plays now the immediate knight c6. So after d4, you take the pawn, knight takes d4, and now you play knight f6. That's the proper Sveshnikov. If you want a backdoor Sveshnikov, there's the Kalashnikov with immediate e5, which could transpose later in Sveshnikov after knight b5. If you did play knight f6 and they did play knight c3, you can play d6, you've transposed in Sveshnikov. But alternatively, you can play more, uniquely to this. You can just play a6 and encourage knight d6. So the Kalashnikov is a bit of a relative to Sveshnikov. But anyway, so knight f6, knight c3, e5. I fell in love with this variation for many years. So knight b5. The reason I fell in love with it is the dynamics. After knight b5, d6, bishop g5, a6, knight a3, believe it or not. So the knights are hobbling around. b5, and now white has two main candidate moves, bishop takes f6 or knight d5. You need to know both if you want to play this. Bishop takes f6 is very dynamic. G takes, knight d5, and black is accepting a terrible pawn structure, or terrible looking pawn structure rather, with gaping hole on d5, but you get semi-open g-file pressure, you've got the two bishops. There's a lot to play for. It's become very popular at Grandmaster level. Kasparov has played it with white and black. Shirov, a number of Grandmasters have played the Sveshnikov variation.